Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also, we are going to have 2 polling questions during today's presentation, so hopefully we can get you all engaged and answering those questions. And at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is the key to DevOps, testing early in the pipeline. Our speaker today is Joe Lust, who is the software engineer at mabl. Hey, Joe, how are you? Great to see you.
Hey there.
All right, I know you have a great presentation on tap, so I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and let you get right to it.
Thanks a lot. Hi, thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about how to optimize your DevOps lifecycle. And one way to do that is testing at every stage of the development lifecycle. And we'll explain exactly how and why you should do that. Oops, one second. My name is Joe Lust. I'm a software engineer here at mabl, and I've been working in the cloud for more years than I'd like to count. But one thing at mabl I do is work on tons of infrastructure and solving all sorts of problems, though at the heart of all of them is working on tests. We're always focused on testing and quality and how to maximize that across our entire infrastructure. And doing so, we've learned quite a few things, but I'll let Fortune sum that up for us. So, as Fortune mentions here, what's happened is that generally developers are starting to get much better tools, much more efficient tools for developing and shipping code. Now we've got tools, for example, like NPM and Node servers and React web apps, so we can ship very, very rapidly. Unfortunately, though, a lot of our testing solutions, they haven't kept up with that. So while we've got those great CD pipelines for shipping code and these great tools for making it, the bottleneck sometimes can be in between. Now, you're probably familiar with this classic diagram for DevOps. And as you know, DevOps is really disrupting the way that we develop and ship software. Because as you might remember, historically, we didn't really make changes that often because changes were the source of bugs. But now, with all these new developer tools, all these new CI/CD tools, we're shipping changes all the time. And so while on that testing side, it used to take weeks or months to create all the tests and get all the coverage we wanted to achieve, now we've only got hours to make those tests because we want to ship the code every few hours. And those tests we create, they used to take a long time to execute. Some of them even used to be more manual than automatic, but now they need to run very quickly because, again, they're holding back our ability to ship code and to ship it rapidly. And that's where the bottleneck that we're trying to solve really emerges. The outdated testing tools we've got, they're very serial. They don't run in parallel like all of the great development tools we have now and all of the ops tools we've got, as you can see here in this diagram. They really are pinching us and restraining how much and how quickly we can ship quality. Now, I'm sure that you also have experienced this. So I'd like to ask, as a quick participation question to everybody, how often does your team do deployments? Are you deploying? Why don't you take that?
Yeah, the first polling question is up on the screen now. How often does your team deploy? You can select from daily, weekly, monthly, or quarterly. give you guys a couple seconds to go ahead and make your choice. And while we're waiting, just a quick reminder, as Joe is going through his presentation, if you have a question, please don't wait for the question and answer period. You are free to ask your question in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time during the presentation. All right, I'm going to give you guys about 5 more seconds to go ahead and make your suggestion, your selection, and then we'll go ahead and close things out. And I'm going to do so now in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, here are the results. Looks like the majority of folks are deploying once a week, which kind of sounds like the industry normal. Am I right about that, Joe?
Definitely, that's consistent with what we've experienced with our customers, definitely.
All right, I'll go ahead and hide these results. Let you get back to your presentation.
So thanks for the participation, everybody. And as you saw, oftentimes folks are deploying, on a weekly basis. One second, let me find where my slides went and hid to. There we are. Are deploying on a weekly basis, and we saw about a quarter of you are actually deploying on a monthly basis. And that is somewhat far from where we really want to be, from where DevOps can really let us get to, because we all hear about Facebook and other companies that deploy all the time, every day. So I'll give you an example of what that new normal looks like. And I don't want to say that mabl's normal. We're always aspirational. We're no Facebook. But here at mabl, we've got only 22 engineers overall in the company. And yet they're pushing about 80 releases every week. And of course, when we think about releases, oftentimes you have more than just one product in your company. And so, we have many products at mabl. We push many releases, usually somewhere about 15 to 18 every day. And when you do that, you really have to have some way of handling all those tests and that quality. And when you start thinking about that, those tests, they really start to add up. So for example, let's say you don't have that many tests. You have 50 test scripts. And each one of those test scripts, maybe they have like 3 scenarios, like 3 different test cases that they're asserting against your application that you're testing. And of course, you don't want to test just one browser. You want to test a number of browsers. So maybe you want Internet Explorer and Safari, and Firefox, and then Chrome is so popular, maybe you want a few different versions of Chrome since they come out every 6 weeks. And then you have different targets within those that you want to test. And then finally, how many different deployments are you testing of those different applications? And so in this simple case here, that's 11,000 tests a day that you need to run. And that's quite a few. And then we also need to think about how long do those tests take? Because many tests, they can be a little bit slow, especially if they start to work with browsers and other systems. And so in this case, let's say we have fairly quick tests, 7 minutes per test. Now that's about 1,300 hours a day of tests you need to run just to keep up with the rate at which your developers are trying to ship code. And think about that, 1,300 hours. We know that there's only 24 hours in a day. So 1,300 hours, what is that? That's like 20, that's a bunch of days. We need to have a way to go faster than that if we're going to keep up. And the other challenge is that we don't have all day to run the tests, because individuals on your team, your engineers, they need to get that feedback right away. It's very timely. And so when they need those tests run, it's not at midnight, it's going to be right around when they merge their code, so they can decide, am I ready to ship it? And if they have to wait all day, then they're not going to get much done. So in this case, we're showing that we need high concurrency because we want to get through those series of tests as quickly as we can so that the results are still relevant and they're not slowing down your team. So in this case, if we wanted to get the ideal maybe 10-minute window, well then think about it. We need to now run hundreds of hours of compute in just a few minutes. But using new DevOps tools that we have at our disposal, like the cloud, we can spin up lots of elastic instances. We can have many, many machines running the tests, not just the classic way where we might have a few test machines sitting in a corner of your office. And so at mabl, for example, where we run a lot of tests against it, mabl tests mabl, or our customers, you might see 200 or 300 VMs spun up in the cloud instantly just to run a bunch of tests in a few minutes and then spin back down. And that's the ideal with modern DevOps in the cloud of how you can get those hundreds or thousands of tests run in only a few minutes and not slow down your team. So we mentioned a minute ago, what Forrester had said about how DevOps was outpacing testing. We also need to think about what has been happening in testing lately, because there are innovations happening in testing automation. There are new things coming out, but in many ways, we found at mabl at least, they're not really helping change the way that you're getting tests done. They're not making it easier compared to how cloud tools are helping you develop, modern languages and frameworks are helping you make code. And so there's a gap there. And at mabl, we've found that the classic way that this used to be done doesn't really hold up anymore. So before, right around here, when you say, okay, I'm about to do a release, well, then maybe you're going to do some testing. Or maybe right when you're doing a deployment, we're going to do some testing. But the trouble is, that's let bugs back up all the way through the life cycle here. So ideally, we would shift left. We would shift earlier, and we would test here when you're doing each build, and we'd test when you're going to merge and before you merge, and ideally, as you code and as you work in your branches, or even with TDD, before you finish making the design, you'd be testing all the time. And if you can do that, then we catch bugs around the entire cycle here, not just before they go out. And finally, you should consider that the tests you've written are a great indicator of how your system's operating. So keep in mind, we might ship the code and then things break. How do you know if things broke in production? Well, we can keep using those same tests that you've invested in, and we can test production when it's deployed and keep an eye on it, monitor it. And in doing so, we've really started testing around the entire life cycle, and it's really helped us capture those bugs throughout and really increase our quality. One second, it's still in my mouse. One moment. I have to figure out. Okay, excuse me for that little delay. So if we were to sum that up though, this really comes to what we're calling the era of intelligent testing. How can we improve on all of these fronts? Well, one thing we mentioned is we can run tests in the cloud. We can use that elastic ability to run all of those hundreds or thousands of tests at once. Additionally, we can use new technologies to make creating tests easier, because if creating tests is hard, we don't make lots of tests. Additionally, when you make all of those tests, because as I said, now we're in the cloud, we have many more releases, many more tests to create. What do we do when they break? That can be really challenging. You probably know that as an engineer. I know I used to spend so much time in Jenkins. I go in Jenkins and I'd look at all the log outputs and try to figure out what happened. If it was good or if it was bad, I still had to go through all those logs. Ideally though, you really shouldn't have to do that. Your tests should fix themselves and they should produce insightful output. So you don't have to go digging. So as an example, imagine you have a test that's very good, it always passes. Then we shouldn't tell you that it passed 1,000 times in a row. We'll just tell you the first time that it passed. And then if it fails, we don't have it fail over and over again and send you emails all night long. I think we've all been there, where you come to work and your email box is just full of the same thing. What you really want is insightful messages that tell you exactly what happened when it's important. And finally, we've mentioned CI/CD here, that right-hand side of the funnel. We really need to integrate with the right-hand side to make sure that all of these tests are run automatically in your CI/CD pipelines and work well with the CI/CD pipelines to harness their power. And in doing so, they are always going to run, because as we know, if we don't make something automatic, it's probably not going to happen. Overall, though, this really paints the picture of a modern way of taking a look at testing, the era of intelligent testing. And as we do this, as I mentioned earlier, we really need to move closer to the developer, shifting left. And what we're showing here in this diagram is that we can get greater quality by moving further away from production, because we really don't want code to fail in production. That's when your boss calls you, that's when the CEO gets upset, or you become famous on Twitter for that bug that shipped. Ideally, we catch that as early as possible. And by shifting left, we're not just catching that in the traditional model here in the purple in QA and staging, but we're catching it early all the time in the code creation, in the code review, in the merge to master. And in doing so, and shifting left here, we really enable capturing those bugs as early as possible. And doing so has a number of benefits, which we'll touch on here in just a moment. So what are those benefits? Generally, they're threefold. One is they're saving time, the most precious commodity on your team. Two, they're saving money, because we don't want those negative business impacts, those broken shopping carts. And three, it's really helping your team collaborate on quality across the team, throughout the org. So let's jump into those. One customer of ours, we've done a case study, which actually you can link to at the bottom here, Maestro QA, found that their legacy provider they worked with, the top part of this diagram here, only really let them test on the right-hand side in QA and in prod. And this meant that they didn't really have a lot of coverage because these tests were slow and they were costly to author and work with. And so when they started working with mabl, they actually found, and you'll find the numbers in the case study, that they were able to dramatically reduce the cost to actually speed up the time to ship, and further to reduce the number of bugs they had, all notably because they moved to the left, because now they're actually testing in dev, in their integration environment, in their local environments, on their branches, in their pull requests. They're testing throughout that entire life cycle, and they really reap the benefits. Again, you can click on the link there in the slide deck we'll share, and you can get the exact details. So now another poll. We mentioned the costs are much improved. What do you think the relative cost of catching a bug in production is?
Yeah, so the polling question should be up on your screen now. What do you think the relative cost of a bug in production is? You can select from 5x more, 10x more, 20x more, or 30x more. Go ahead and make your selection. And a final reminder that if you do have a question for, sorry, my little Slack thing is just bouncing here. If you do have a question for Joe, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we will try to get to as many as we can during the question and answer period. We've gotten a healthy number of people who have made their selection so far, so I'll give you guys about 5 more seconds, and then I will close out the poll and push out the results. All right, here we go. I'm gonna go close it now. I'm closing it, and there are the results. Looks like the majority of folks are saying 20x more. That seems pretty, actually, no, they're saying 30x more. That seems really high, Joe. Is that correct?
Well, I was hoping for the shock and impact of revealing the number here, but it looks like we've got an audience that really, they know the stats. They actually know a lot about testing. So around 30x is the right answer. Great job, everybody.
That's pretty scary, actually. All right, I'm gonna let you get back to your presentation.
Sure, so as a lot of you alluded to there, that number around 30x is a number that the National Institutes of Standard and Technology found, and they did a very detailed scientific study. And the folks that said 20x, great job there too. But the point here is that the earlier that you can catch that bug, the less it's going to cost you. And if we think about that, if we unpack it, it makes a lot of sense. Because remember, when that bug gets to production, maybe the shopping cart breaks. Maybe you stop getting revenue as a company, and then you have reputational risk. People start tweeting about how broken your product is, and you can't just fix it. Now it's going to go through triaging. QA is going to file tickets. You have to find an engineer. Maybe product management has to go and plan. There's a lot of steps that happen if we have that bug happen in production. But if we caught it back when we were designing that system, or right when the developer was coding, as we see here, it's about 30 times cheaper than if we'd let it get to production. And as they say, I think the statistic is about $113 billion annually are spent fixing defects. You can imagine if we could take that down by 30, that'd be a tremendous savings for the whole industry. So I think that really gives you the idea of what the cost savings are. The third item I mentioned was really trying to create a culture of quality in your organization. And at mabl, we really find that making testing and quality an integrated process across the org helps break down those silos. There shouldn't just be the QA team, and it shouldn't be their problem to fix and find every bug. That's an impossible task. What we really want to have is effective communication across our team using tools that really help everybody see the quality, review it, and contribute to it. And then to also make sure that that quality tool works with your other tools, like your issue tracking and Jira. And in doing so, when your teams can collaborate in quality, it's no longer that pinching on your pipeline. It's actually going to make the team much more efficient and help you, as I said, break down that silo and ship much faster. So to summarize there, we really want to shift left with the quality, as we said, to save with time, which is something you can't make more of and you're never going to get back, to save on costs, as we saw from NIST, and to really help your team collaborate and have that culture of quality. Because above all, we don't want that bug to get to production where it's going to have that negative business impact and everyone is going to really wish it hadn't got there. But let me give you an example of how at mabl, we really internalize and live this. Because as I said, we're a testing company. We sell testing software. So we are totally focused on quality ourselves. We have built it into all of our tools throughout. So here we're showing a kind of a simplified view of what that life cycle for the code and the developer looks like. And on the right-hand side here in green, we've got the QA environment and the production environment. And that's typically where testing would have happened, usually in the build-up to before that weekly or monthly release cycle that you saw on the poll. But what we really believe is that we want to change that and move it further to the left to help the engineers like yourself really become part of that quality process. And one part of that is the local branch environment, where you're actually doing your work on your laptop before you push that code. And then second is once you push that code, but it's not merged, we're calling that the preview environment here. How are you going to isolate bugs in there and have your team help find those bugs before they get merged? This is the place at mabl, at least, where we really try to catch all of our bugs, and we think it can bring a lot of benefits to everybody. So here, as I said, in the local branch, we can kind of think about the home of the developer. Now, if you're like me, you kind of have what amounts to like 3 homes. I spend a lot of my day sitting in my IDE, your development environment, and maybe it's VS Code, or maybe it's Eclipse, or perhaps it's IntelliJ. And you spend a lot of time there, so that should be a place you can do your testing easily. And another place I spend a lot of my time, you probably do too, is doing pull requests. I get to work every day and I review all those code reviews that people have asked for my input on. And so if you're in any of those tools, that's where you're going to spend probably a third of your day. And finally, you're moving code back and forth between the two, between the IDE and your pull requests. You're probably using a lot of command line time. And you're always typing in there, and we need to meet you there as well in the command line, the third of the 3 homes where engineers spend most of their day. And so at mabl, our engineers are always building features that help themselves, since, as I said, we test mabl with mabl. And one thing that actually started out internally, and then we released it because our customers said, wow, that's amazing, is the mabl command line interface. And the key part of the command line interface is now, since you work in the command line all day, you can make your tests in the command line, and then you can also run them right there without ever having to break your flow state, without having to have a context switch. And since you're in there making those code changes, when tests are easy to run and easy to create, then they're not really a pain at all. Because I think you've probably been where I have been before, and you spend a week, you build a feature, and then someone says, "Where's the test, Joe?" And you're like, "Oh no, I've got to make a test." Well, if making a test is easy, it's not a headache then, and it's something you're going to do all the time, and that really helps make quality ubiquitous. On top of the mabl CLI, one really neat feature that we built, this was again kind of a one-off thing one of our engineers put together on the team, a guy named Mike, is we added headless running. And what headless is, you might not be familiar with this, but browsers now, like Firefox and Chrome, they've added features that let you run the browser without opening a browser. So I don't know if you've ever spent time with Selenium, but it used to drive me a little crazy because if you ran the tests, windows are just popping up all over the place. And so you can either run the tests and go get coffee or not run the tests. And sometimes people don't run the tests. Well, with headless mode, these tests actually run very fast because basically there's no browser to draw, and they're never popping up. They're never in your way. So you keep making code. So you're going to save a lot of time there. And actually, when you're running them locally on your computer, there's no charge for them. So this has actually been something that our customers at mabl love. We've been shipping many, many versions of this, adding features left and right, and there are many more features coming. And just to note, you can see here the output on the right-hand side. When you're actually running the test, you can see it's telling you everything that happened, everything I clicked on, all the details. It's something that, again, really helps reduce that risk of making tests because it's very easy to do, and it's something that you don't have to break your flow state. You can stay in your home on the CLI. A quick mention here as well is if you're a developer and you're making lots of tests, there's another challenge you run into, which is, what about that test that's being used in QA right now? I can't change it yet because my feature hasn't been pushed to QA yet. How do I change the test without breaking QA? Well, you probably use branching, whether you're in Git or Subversion. And so we added branching into mabl. And with this, you can actually version control your tests. You can test them against different environments before you merge them into the main line of your tests. We even have a feature known as snapshotting. It's like a tag. And now you can, as you see here in the mabl UI or in the CLI, make branches, branch tests, merge tests. You can work with tests just the very same way that you work with code. And that's a very natural experience for engineers, at least I find. So I mentioned there's another home for engineers, another place that we spend all of our time, and that's the IDE, the integrated development environment, for example, like VS Code. Well, one of our engineers again said, man, wouldn't it be great if I could just run my tests in here, if I didn't have to go out to that CLI? And so we built a new feature here. And you can see at the top of that code segment, you can import the mabl CLI into your code. So now you're actually running those headless tests from your code, and they can be checked in with your code. They can be run in your IDE when you just say, run tests on this file. You don't even have to go to the command line if you don't want to. And as I said, they get checked in with your source control. And as an example here, we can see as you're coding, you can have these keep running in your tool of choice. And if you're like me, you get that list of green checks and you think, yes, I've done it now. My code is quality. And so that's why we did this integration with the IDE, because it's a place you're used to working, so your tests should work really easily with you there too, to make it easy to create tests. So that's your local branch. That's on your laptop. But of course, we have to work with other folks. We have to move beyond our laptop, and that's where the preview environment comes in, the place where others can see your code. But let me tell you in detail what a preview environment really is. So a preview environment, I don't know if you've heard of this before. There's actually a number of names for it. You might have heard of review app. You might have heard of ephemeral environment, review environment, poll environment. They're all the same thing. It's a place where you can put your code, just your changes, nobody else's, and it's on demand and short-lived. That means if you break that environment, nobody else cares. The challenge historically is that we only had a few environments at other companies I worked at. Maybe there was one UAT environment and a staging environment. And if you worked at a really big company, maybe you had like 2 or 3 UAT environments. But the challenge was if you broke the UAT environment, everybody was going to tell you, your Slack was going to fill up with people saying, why did Joe break dev? Why did Joe break UAT? Well, with the preview environment, It's an on-demand environment just for you and just for that change. So for example, if you pushed out 10 commits, you can have a preview environment for every commit. And if it breaks, you don't care. The whole point is to give a place to test your change in isolation. And now that we have this preview environment, we really need to make best use of it, to harness it and make it work for you. And this is how we do it at mabl. We have the preview environment and we run all the tests against it. Because remember, with your testing automation, usually you need a place to test out that new change. And since we actually have a preview environment now for every single change, for example, in mabl, we have hundreds of preview environments. You can find out for each commit, each change you made, exactly what the result was. And secondly, to harness this, we really need to put those results into our merge request or pull request view. And that way, everybody can see what that looked like, what those results looked like. And this is going to let us test everything, basically, before we merge, as opposed to in the past, where we only found out after we merged to master or main that we broke it. And if, again, you're like me, one company I worked at, you had to wear a dunce cap because you broke the build. Well, now you can't break the build because you're testing everything beforehand. And down at the bottom here, we actually have an example of something we use at mabl, where we call this the mabl ops bot. And every time you make a change, it gets pushed to preview environment, and this little bot pops up in your pull request and says, ding, ding, here's where your preview environment is. Additionally, an integration that we've made for GitLab is every time that you run those tests in your preview environment, you actually get the full output. So if someone else drops into this, they can see what those results are. And of course, that person doesn't have to be a testing expert. They don't have to be an engineer even. They can see exactly what happened and what the results are very easily. But let me give you an example of what a preview environment really looks like in practice. So here is a merge request in GitLab, for example. And if you're like me, this is kind of a typical case you might run into. As we can see at the top there, the engineer that created this her name is 10x Developer, the infamous 10x Developer. And it's a top-notch PR, I'm told, and it appears to be really important for a major customer. And we need to really ship this as soon as possible. And if you're like me, you get all these all day long, all these pull requests, and so you're always trying to get through them. And we see here that, excuse me, that it's just CSS. So it really, how bad could it be? But I'm not a CSS wizard, so I'm not sure. But again, you're probably given this pressure going to say, well, it needs to be reviewed right away. You're going to go down here and click approve. Now, what if there was an easier way to see what this is if you didn't know a lot about CSS? Well, what if, in this example in GitLab, we use what they call a review environment or a preview environment? Well, we could click on that if we're an engineer or a business analyst, or a product owner, and we could see exactly what this feature is going to look like. And in this case, we see that the login to mabl.com looks very unusual. This isn't normal. Just so you know, we're not actually a candy store. We don't sell candy canes. But in that merge request we just looked at, there were only 2 lines of CSS changed. But if you'd actually shipped it, it probably would have completely broken the login flow. But now, if we can point our automation at it, we would have been able to say, oh no, don't merge this. This has got a really bad impact. Or if anybody in your entire organization, regardless of their technical skill level, had just gone in to look at it, they would have seen the obvious fact that there's a problem here. All of this through the power of the preview environment. So I very much encourage folks to give them a try. So that's really the whole spectrum of what we're trying to achieve here at mabl by moving everybody further to the left and enabling developers like you and me to test both locally and in their preview environments, not just in the classic locations of the QA environment and the production environment. All of this is really a way to bring testing to the modern cloud and bring it into the future so we can unblock that DevOps pipeline. To summarize, what we really need to do here is we have to test early, and we want to test often, all of those commits as we saw in the preview builds. And we want to test everywhere throughout that DevOps lifecycle. And at mabl, we really think that this is what we call an intelligent test automation tool, and it can really be valuable for the entire team. In my case, I'm very much focused on trying to make these reliable tests. And if you make them very easily, like I do, I usually fire up the COI and I can just say make test, pop open the browser, and I can record a test. It's very easy to make and maintain those tests. And as I said, pop open the browser and record a test. I'm actually able to go through for my new feature that I'm testing and do a customer relevant test. I'm going to log in, I'm going to go put it in the shopping cart, make sure it's there, check the price. I'm not just trying to find a bunch of random Selenium scripts and glue them together. I'm doing something very relevant. And when it fails, I get those comprehensive test results. And that's very useful because oftentimes someone might tell you about a bug and you have to go start trying to reproduce it. You have to go find a copy of Internet Explorer 11, things like that. But at mabl, I can drop in and I can get the very detailed results, see the screenshots, the error logs. I can see the memory that was running in Chrome, for example, or in Internet Explorer, all the web requests that were made. And you can find the bug in a very detailed way such that you can even go fix it and never have to touch a browser at all. And finally, using all these tools together in a unified platform, I find it really makes it much easier to work in my daily workflow because now I can find out about a test failure in Slack, for example, and I can see what the changes are in the preview environment and that they broke early. And I can glance at a Jira ticket and see what the mabl test results are in the Jira ticket, because now it's worked across all the tools and across all the things your team generally uses to really bring those benefits across the entire team with that intelligent test automation. So with that, that is the meat of the presentation, but I'd really like to take a break now and let everybody ask the questions that have been accumulating throughout the talk. Thanks again.
Yeah. So we've gotten some great questions in, but there's plenty of time, guys. If you have a question for Joe, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. Let's go ahead and dive right on into the ones we do have. Okay, first one, we use Jira for our bugs. How does that fit into this shift left process?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So with Jira, which is kind of synonymous in many circles with tracking bugs, that is kind of the de facto standard. So obviously you want in this unified platform to have whatever you're doing for testing and quality work well with Jira. And so we've spent a lot of time at mabl integrating with Jira. And so, for example, if you have a bug, you can link it to your Jira ticket, but you don't just get the fact that it's linked to a mabl test. You can click through and see the mabl results. You can see the results in Jira from all of the runs. You can see the current status of the bug in Jira. So if the test has finally started passing, that appears in Jira. And of course, if you're like me, you make lots of Jira tickets. So anything that helps you make Jira tickets more easily is a real time saver. And so throughout the mabl app and our tools, you can also just click a Jira button and say, hey, I found a bug or something failed, I want to file a Jira ticket, and it will go straight into your Jira system. So Jira is something that we wholeheartedly support across our product.
Nice. All right, great. Next question here. How is your software development team set up at mabl? And who owns testing and quality?
Well, that's a great question. I think in many organizations, you would say that QA is kind of its own silo, its own team, and QA owns quality. What we've tried to do at mabl in general is to say that we don't really have any teams, and by that I mean to say when something breaks, we don't say, oh, it's the X team's problem, not it's everybody's problem. And so at mabl, at least everybody owns quality. Every developer owns quality, and when something breaks in production, everybody jumps on it. But we really try to empower engineers. That's kind of our vision, that everybody should be able to make those tests, update the tests, and own quality.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, guys, plenty of time for questions. If you have one, you know what to do. Just use that GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. Next question. So, Joe, as a developer yourself, how has mabl helped you in your day-to-day workflow?
That's a good question. I'd say that, one way it really helps, basically a lot of the things we talked here, but for example, I've got the Slack integration, with the tests I'm running. So it's nice that I can kind of let all those tests run on every one of my builds. I'm sitting here in IntelliJ and I'm typing away. And if I see Slack pop up, then I find out that there's an issue. I can just click on that and look at it and quickly and easily, fix my code. So I find that the ability to really, to work with those tools and not really break up my flow is very useful. But also, as I alluded to earlier, it's got to be easy to make those tests. Developers don't necessarily love making tests, but anything that makes it easier to make the tests, definitely makes my life easier. And so that's where I usually use the mabl CLI pretty often to go and make a new test and record the test to make sure each one of those new features that I'm bringing to the forefront can be put out there real easily. And frankly, recording with mabl or the mabl CLI is so much easier than the way I used to try to do it with React, where I'd spend a day and a half trying to get a test to work using pure unit testing components. So those are two ways, with the communications integrations and with the CLI, that it's made my life a lot easier.
All right, great. Next question here. This is an interesting one. So do companies test in production? What is the use case here?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so testing in production has sometimes gotten a bad rap. I think there's that meme about the most interesting man in the world who says, "I only test in production." By test in production, what I was mentioning earlier in the slides was that you can use your tests to make sure that your production app doesn't break, because oftentimes we might only run tests when we're getting ready to deploy, like in a staging environment, or right when we do deploy. But after you've deployed, you deployed on Friday, now it's Saturday, your app can still break. And so, having those tests, those end-to-end browser tests that can test that entire important customer workflow and do it in production are very valuable to tell you when something breaks in production. So as an example, in mabl, we have a workspace called mabl versus mabl, and it's how we actually test a lot of our features. And it's running all day, every day. We have a group of tests called our 24/7 paging tests, and we're really confident in those tests. But if they fail, somebody in Boston is going to be woken up even at 2 a.m. And we find that it really provides a great way to know if there's an impact in your application production that would impact your customer.
Got it. All right. We've gotten some really great questions, and I'm really, really impressed by these. But there's plenty of time, guys. If you have a question, go ahead, send it on in. We'll just keep throwing them at Joe until we're done. Okay, next question. Is mabl open source?
Sure. So at this point, mabl is not an open source product, but the offerings we have, for example, like the mabl CLI, you can download those, use them, locally, as I mentioned, and those test runs, aren't something that's billed. Additionally, if you want to try out using mabl, it's a completely free trial, not one of those free trials where you have to put a credit card in, and you can just run as many tests as you want, try all the features. So those are the ways folks can use mabl right now. It's not open source, but that definitely is something we've heard before and we're thinking about.
All right. Woohoo, you heard it here first, folks. Okay, next question. How do you manage bugs that turn out to be a requirement miss and the impact is huge as it impacts that week's release?
How to handle bugs that are a requirement miss. Yeah, that's challenging. I think sometimes that comes down to, you really have to start trying to gauge what the impact of that bug is, because organizations, they do sometimes intentionally release a bug, and that's kind of more of a judgment call where you have to say, what's the cost of not delivering feature A, even though there's going to be a bug in feature B, because sometimes it's hard to disentangle those. Sure. And so it really comes down to what the cost of pushing that release out is. Can you skip the release? Can you not? One thing we generally try to do at mabl, kind of a way to cheat here, is use things like feature flags. So you can make a new feature and you can put it behind a feature flag, and if there's a bug in it, you can just turn off the feature flag. So now you're still shipping that code, and as you said, maybe it's really a missing requirement, but no one's going to see this bug because you've turned off that part of the application. And then when you get that fixed, you can turn the feature back on. So that's where, in those sorts of situations, it's either that judgment call or using some neat technology like, feature flags from, for example, Launch Darkly.
All right, great. Next question, does mabl work for non-web applications? How about integrations between multiple systems where both systems need to be running?
Interesting. So on the first part, right now, mabl principally works with web applications. We're working on trying to expand that into other areas. So do stay tuned. Though you mentioned when you have complex systems, when you need, as you said, kind of like two systems have to be up to run your test. And we work with that a few different ways. One way is we have webhooks set up. So you can say, before you run the tests, I want you to call my webhook. We have basically set up and tear down webhooks. And so what a lot of our customers do is they might have like a Python Flask server, or you can even call straight to a Jenkins server, and it'll say, okay, make this web request. We're going to do some setup. We'll make sure all the systems are ready. And then we'll send the response back to mabl. Mabl runs all your tests, and then mabl calls your shutdown webhook and says, okay, guys, you can get rid of all that stuff. You can turn down those systems, for example. So that's one way we achieve this with webhooks. Additionally, when you write mabl tests, there's a concept of an API step. So you can make an API call if you need to set up one system or get data out of another. So those are a few ways that we do that. And then finally, when you're in the browser, mabl also supports tabs. So we'll have people that do things like, open tab, log into one system, open another tab, log into another system, and they go back and forth between the two tabs in the browser and do data between multiple systems. So there's a number of ways from webhooks to API calls to multi-tab that you can achieve that.
Excellent, excellent. All right, guys, we have about 3 questions left. But there's, like I said before, there's plenty of time. So if you do have a question for Joe, go ahead and use that GoToWebinar control panel, get it on in. We've got the time. Okay, next question here. How do unit and integration tests fit into this philosophy?
Good question. We definitely believe that those are still important. What we see the mabl tests as being generally is what we call an end-to-end test. It's something where you really want to see the application the way your customer would see it. Because there's classic tests where you can do a test on a React component on the UI and make sure that clicking the button turns it green. But when you run it in a browser and run it end-to-end, served over the web, the button doesn't work right. So testing it in the actual browser, being launched in an actual data center is going to give you replication of what exactly the customer is going to see, which sometimes a unit test wouldn't. Though unit tests, definitely have their place. We don't want to run a mabl test just to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. There are some things that really make sense being written, in Chai or Jest or JUnit or whatever the tool you prefer is. And because unit tests run super quick at milliseconds, they definitely have their place. But we think that that's generally something you want to have like in your build. When you're building the artifact, you run the unit tests, but nobody's able to run their unit tests in production. So that's a differentiator there with the end-to-end tests in mabl. And then finally, you mentioned integration tests. And integration tests are oftentimes kind of a more elaborate unit test, but they're still probably not going to touch as much as those end-to-end tests. And an integration test probably is still something you wouldn't want to run in production. So that's really the differentiator, I'd say, more of that end-to-end aspect. But at mabl, for example, we still do have unit tests and we still do have integration tests.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. All right, so let's see, next question. One of the major challenges with automation is keeping tests up to date with changes in application. Is there a way to expedite this activity through mabl?
That is an awesome question, and I think it's one thing that everybody that's written tests had to deal with. It makes me think of a place I worked previously, a big bank, where we had like 3,000 UI tests written in Ruby and Cucumber. But the challenge was a designer went and just changed some CSS on the homepage, like one div, and then I get 3,000 test failures. There went my week. So what we've believed at mabl from the start, from day one, 3.5 years ago, is that the tests, they have to adapt. And so there's a concept in mabl called an auto heal. And so what happens is, when you went into your app and the button, it doesn't say, checkout anymore, it says buy, but classically all the tests would have broken. Now we actually record tons of information about that element. You know, what color is it? What's it wrapped around? You know, does it have like a shopping basket icon on it? All sorts of aspects of it. How big is it? You know, where on the screen is it? And then we say, okay, I can't find the icon you wanted me to click on, but there's an icon that's very, very similar. And so we actually have what we call candidate election. And this is all part of our auto healing feature, where we try to figure out, I couldn't find the thing you wanted, but I found this thing, and click on it. And that's one of our core value add features there. And that's how most of these tests, they just keep running regardless of people changing it. Because as I mentioned before, we run tons of tests in mabl, but our own application, the application you'll use in the web, it changes every day, but the tests don't break because we actually adapt on the fly and auto heal.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So we are about 9 minutes to the top of the hour. We have, I think we've gotten 2 more questions in. So we'll go ahead and ask those, and then we'll close our question and answer period. But that does not mean that if you've got a question, you can't send it in. We just, we'll just have Joe or somebody from mabl follow up with you guys offline. Let's get to those last questions. Can mabl consolidate the test results from unit tests, BDD tests, manual tests, etc.? If not, does mabl expose its results for other systems?
Good question. We've been making a lot of efforts around this lately. One of our engineers, Bertold, was just doing a pull request review. We merged some features for Bamboo the other day. The answer is that while we don't show your unit tests, like your JUnit tests in mabl, we do make it possible to integrate the mabl tests into wherever else you have your test results. So, for example, if you're running with our Bamboo integration for the Bamboo CI/CD server, or for example, Jenkins, you can get the mabl test results in standard JUnit XML format. So they will just go into whatever tool you're used to putting all of your results into, and it'll think that they're JUnit results. So there's a way to get mabl test results and put them right with all of your other test results. And the final thing I would just add on there is we have an API. We call it our execution results API. And with that, you can also just get the raw data. If there's anything else you want to do with it or put it anywhere else, you can do that as well.
Nifty. All right, great. All right, so let's give you your last question, then we'll give you a break. How long is the setup period / learning curve for new teams using mabl?
So at mabl, I would say it's very low. Above all other things we hear in customer calls is people say, wow, that was really easy to use. Usually when we design a UI, we try to say, okay, how to make this really simple? So with mabl, we actually use something called a training extension. We call it our trainer. It's part of a Chrome extension you'd install. So all you would really do is just go sign up for that trial, click install the training extension, and just give it a URL. And now you just start clicking around, going around that web page, and all of it's being recorded in real time. And of course, the things you might want to do that are a little deeper than that. And so you can go and edit that test you've just created. You can put in more advanced features like testing email and APIs and things like that. But just to go from starting to making a test to running your test suite is actually very fast, like a matter of minutes. And that's something that we've spent a ton of time at mabl trying to make as simple and easy as possible.
That's great. That's great. Okay. All right. We are 6 minutes to the top of the hour, so I am cutting you off now. So no more question and answer period. But like I said before, if you do have a question for Joe, you can still put it in the GoToWebinar control panel. Folks at mabl are getting a copy of all of the questions that came in. So I am sure that somebody from the organization will be more than happy to follow up with you offline and get your question answered. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the presentation, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. You will be receiving an email post-webinar that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website. So you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And while you're there, please check out the other webinars that we have, both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be something there that piques your interest. Joe, what a great presentation. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, for your knowledge. Just really, really good stuff. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And judging from the number and the quality of the questions that came in, I know they got a lot out of it too. So on behalf of the audience, thank you. So, and I do want to thank the audience also for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy the 5 minutes that were given back to you, and above all, please stay safe.
Cheers.